Well, this is Ed Stetzer Live, and this and every Saturday we come to you with, people helping us think more rightly, biblically, Christianly about topics, themes of our day, and how to live faithfully in these times. I'm the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, but on Saturdays I get to be your radio host. I should say that it's not always, like increasingly many of you listen by a podcast, so you're probably listening like on Thursday stop saying it's Saturday, but please forgive me. We're live, a couple hundred terrestrial stations across the country, and so we think in terms of this as Saturday. Those of you listening at another time, we love to have you subscribe, and all of you can as well, because I recognize Saturday radio as sometimes a hit and miss. It's not like drive time when you know you're going to be in the car every day at a certain time. So go ahead and go to edstetzerlive.com, click on the link, subscribe via podcast as well. All right. So our guest today is a new friend, and we're going to introduce you to him. Grant Flynn, is assistant professor of New Testament at Phoenix Seminary, where he teaches New Testament and Greek courses. His first book is called Lament in the Letter of James. Yes, we're going to talk about lament today, but stay with us. It's going to be encouraging by the time we make it through. But he examines the use of the Old Testament lament traditions and their role in the epistles, the letter of James, its theology of suffering and perseverance. He's got a PhD in New Testament from Wheaton College. It turns out we overlap some there as well. And Dr. Flynn is originally from South Carolina, but now living in very hot Phoenix. Grant, thank you for joining us here on Ed Stetzer Live.
Thanks, Ed. Happy to be here.
Well, let's define some terms because, lament is, I don't know how to put this. I go to a large contemporary church here in Southern California, and most of our songs start on a high note, and by the time we're done, ends on a high note. There's not a lot of lament that we experience in a typical church. Lament is something we think of when we're going through a difficult time. But kind of explain before we even get to the letter to James from James, explain to us what lament is considered from a biblical perspective.
We can think about lament in a couple of different ways. We can define it very technically, if you'd like, as I did for my book and as I was working on my dissertation. And if we do that, if we do that according to what we find in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, like places in the Old Testament lament psalms, some of the prophets, places like Job, we can define it something like a distressed cry that is in response to some type of hardship that someone is going through. It's something that's directed to God. So in almost every case, it's the language of prayer, and it's always responsive. And I think what I've seen and what I've been encouraged by in the church recently is the church is, I think, trying to lean more into lament and figuring out how to do that, how to explain it in a way that is biblically sound. And yet sometimes it seems like we still don't exactly know what to do with it, because we do like to have our church services start on a high note, end on a high note, be encouraging as they should be. But I think it's something that we should continue to think more about, not only how we define it, but how we put it, how we weave it into our church services, how we rightly respond to the suffering in our own personal lives and the suffering in the world. And that's what lament is for. It's that responsive, prayerful speaking that allows us to honestly express ourselves to God.
Okay, and so lament is something we do. We express to God our lament, and so we see some of that in the Psalms in particular. So unpack a little bit more. But the most familiar will probably be some of the Psalms of lament, but not everyone's aware of that. So unpack what the speaking part is, what our part is, and unpack a little bit how the Psalms relate.
So if we take the lament Psalms, they're always written in response to some type of difficult circumstance, some type of suffering. David is the most common person who writes the lament Psalms, and if we just look at his lives as they're described in his life as it's described in the Old Testament, it's full of suffering. It's full of really difficult, troubling circumstances. So when David is experiencing these really difficult times, he expresses himself to God in a certain way, in a prayerful manner that often follows a certain type of structure, a certain type of form. And it's not as if we have to follow this form if we're going to likewise lament. Yet this form can be helpful for us in understanding the steps that we might take ourselves through, not only prayerfully, but also emotionally as we try to process and think about the suffering that we're going through. So that form begins with some type of initial address to God, as most of the lament psalms do. They address God directly, God, or oh God, or my God, or Lord, or something like that. And then the psalmist quite quickly moves into what we might call the lament proper. It's the cry of distress. This is where we get language like, how long, O Lord, will you hide your face from me? Or how long will my enemies triumph over me? Or why, God, are these things happening to me? And that really is the largest portion of the psalm. It's where David and the other psalmists and the prophets are laying their situation before God and seeking his help. And that's really what they're after, is seeking God's help in their time of need, in their time of suffering, whether that's physical deliverance from enemies or some type of emotional ease in the midst of what are really difficult psychological or emotional circumstances. And then there's almost always some type of turn, and this is really helpful for us to see. There's some type of turn away from the lament, away from the difficult expression of what's going on, to some type of statement of hope or confidence in God. Because the lamenters, like David, they know that God is faithful. They know that he has a track record of faithfulness. They know that they don't have any reason to really doubt that God will come through for them and help them in some way. So there's an expression of confidence, a statement of confidence, a turn to hope, and then typically some type of vow to praise that concludes the psalm, saying that essentially, despite these difficult things that are happening, I will yet praise the Lord once again. And that's all built on the presumption that God has been faithful and will continue to be faithful. So what I try to express in my work and when I'm talking to students and pastors is that lament really is the language of faith. It's not the language of doubt. It's the language of faith. When we're facing really difficult circumstances, when we're suffering, this is how faithful people like David, like the prophets, express themselves to God.
I guess, I mean, I 100% agree. I would also say that in some seasons of when I've expressed to God my disappointment or lament, I didn't do it as neatly as the psalmist did. And maybe the psalmist took time to write those things down. But I was mad at God. I was angry at God. I remember when my sister died. I was just a young man, about 20 years old. She's just a year older. And I drove over. We lived in Florida. I drove over to the beach, and I was mad at God. I was yelling at God. I was arguing with God. And then eventually, said, Lord, I don't understand this, but I trust you in the midst of this. So, I mean, how lamenty are we allowed to be to God in the midst of pain and difficulty?
The book of Job, I think, gives us an idea of possibly how lamenty we can be.
Job, I know I made up a new word for this, but that's what I do. I make up new words.
I like it. I think it's helpful. Yeah. If we read through Job, if we're honest, I think Job's prayers, at least some of them, probably make us quite uncomfortable because of how honestly he speaks to God, saying things like, God, your arrows are in me, as if he's kind of pointing the finger at God and in some way blaming him for his suffering. And that, as Christians, makes us a little bit uncomfortable. But in a way, I think we can perceive him in some way as kind of showing us what the limits are, or giving us an idea of where the limits might be, at least nearby. So I think we can express ourselves very honestly to God. And I think there's some theological commitments and presuppositions that we can use to actually free ourselves to express ourselves to God in a very honest way. One of them being the fact, as Jesus puts it in the Sermon on the Mount, that we are praying to the God who sees in secret. So we can't hide anything from him anyway. So even if these thoughts well up within us and we don't express those thoughts verbally, God still knows that they're in there. Therefore, we need not act like he doesn't see them, or he can't hear them simply because we don't express them. He knows they're there. And I think there's something that emotionally and psychologically that is healthy for us to express ourselves in a very honest and open way. And I think God invites us to express ourselves in a very honest and open way by giving us books like Job, by giving us these really gut-wrenching lament psalms, by giving us some of the things that the prophets say, like Jeremiah comes to mind, when he himself says, I wish I had not been born because of the suffering that I am going through. So I think the Bible does in some way give us a lot of space to express ourselves very honestly, perhaps showing us where the limits and where some of the boundaries are, and yet freeing us up with the knowledge that God knows it all anyway. So express it to him, because it's in that act of expressing ourselves that we free ourselves also to receive the help and the comfort that God, I think, wants to supply us in our time of need.
Super helpful. And a lot of time in the Old Testament here, we're talking about lament because that's where most of the lament texts or focus is found. But you wrote this book, your first book, Lament in the Letter of James, and you looked to the letter of James, obviously. James 1:2 famously tells us to consider our trials pure joy, which sounds crazy. But you kind of highlight the overlooked voice of the lamenter, where they're pleading for God to change the suffering. Unpack this for us of what you're looking at in the book of James that might build on some of those Old Testament traditions.
The verse you began with is really kind of my launching pad for the book. James 1:2, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And then verse 3, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And that's a verse that I'll certainly come back to. I'll kind of save what I see as really kind of the key to unlocking James's understanding of perseverance and suffering. I'll save that for a little bit later. But it is true that if you just read through James, lament is probably not the thing that jumps off the page to you. It's not something that's really on the surface of the text. It's something that we see a little bit more implicitly, but yet I'll make the case that it is there in a very meaningful and significant way. Now, I have to make it clear that James does not give us lament psalms, or he doesn't use kind of lament proper in the form and in the kind of overt or explicit way that we find in the Old Testament. Yet, I make the case that James does weave lament psalms into the way that he portrays certain figures that he is writing about in his letter, that he also exhorts his readers to lament on a number of occasions. And there's kind of a key lament text that is probably the most obvious to us. It's in James 5:4, where he's writing to a group of people who are suffering particularly kind of acutely among his readers. And it's these farmers who are working in the fields, and they're not actually getting paid for their work. So James says in James 5:4, and he addresses this actually to the people who are withholding their wages. He says, look, the wages you have failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. I think there's a lot going on in that verse. I think James is alluding to a lament psalm, but also he is, in a way, encouraging his readers, these farmers particularly, to continue crying out. He's endorsing their laments in a way. So that's one key text where it's probably the clearest to us, where we might find lament language or lament, the theme of lament. But I could certainly walk through other texts and show how I see lament kind of arising from underneath the text for us.
Okay, we're going to continue our conversation in just a moment with Grant Flynn. I should tell you, this is a pre-recorded show, so we're not able to take your calls today, but it does give us the opportunity to dig a little deeper into the topic. His new book is Lament in the Letter of James. Grant Flynn is a professor at Phoenix Seminary. We're going to continue our conversation about these questions about lament. We're going to talk about what James writes about it, but in general, how do we navigate lament as a form of prayer in response to God? Stay with us to continue our conversation with Grant Flynn. Hey, we're back. Ed Stetzer Live. Grant Flynn's our guest, talking about his new book, Lament in the Letter of James, because Grant, nothing sells better than books on lament. So that's gonna draw the millions of readers. It's actually funny, we were both over at Phoenix Seminary recently, and of course we had Uche Anazor speak at your conference there. Is it called Sacred Truths? Is that the conference we were at? I think so.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And of course, Uche wrote this Christianity Today Book of the Year, a book on apathy. And so, lots of jokes sort of flow out of when you write a book on apathy. Is anyone going to care to buy it, et cetera, et cetera? But I am kind of interested, like, what personally, I've asked Uche this, he's been on the program as well. What personally drove your interest in Lament and Letter of James? And I recognize that was your dissertation work as well. So it might just be that it was an unexplored topic. But typically there's some personal connection as well. Is there for you?
There is. It could, in theory, kind of stem from my own personal hardships and sufferings. I certainly have had some, but not nearly as much as other people in general, or even other people my age have. So that is certainly a part of it. But there is a real, a meaningful relational connection in this book for me. An undergraduate professor of mine at Anderson University, his name is Channing Chrysler. He's really the one that kind of ignited this fire for New Testament studies in me when I was just 18 years old as a freshman student at Anderson. And he did his dissertation work on lament in Romans, in Paul's famous letter. And he would kind of weave his research and his arguments about lament into his lectures. And he was, on the one hand, just an incredible lecturer. He's still teaching. He's a wonderful person. We're good friends now. And he just has this way of kind of not kind of unintentional profundity. He's very profound in what he has to say. And he would say these things about lament, and it really captured my attention. And really, he helped me to see that this is a really under-researched part of New Testament studies. And that's kind of one bucket. That's the lament bucket. And then the James bucket is also at Anderson. I got really interested in the letter of James and did a kind of senior project on the Christology of James, which is something that I hope to pursue in future years. And I didn't do much with James after that. I didn't really do anything with it during seminary, but it always stuck with me. So when it came time to do doctoral work, I was originally working on something in the Gospels, namely, especially Matthew's Gospel. But that project kind of fell through. So I turned my attention to James, and I really just kind of put those two interests together, lament and James. And I found one article that had been written on this topic, and it was quite brief, but it gave me the idea that there's a lot more that could be said about this. And from there, it turned into a
and you did.
dissertation.
You said a lot more
book
about this.
Yes.
And let me say too, for those of you who are listening who are, not necessarily in academia, and, there's a lot of connections here. Grant's at Phoenix Seminary. I'm at the Talbot School of Theology. This program, Moody Radio is a ministry of Moody Bible Institute. You were talking about Anderson University. They have the Clamp Divinity School there. But one of the things, when you get a PhD in a subject, you're supposed to be the world's leading expert in that topic by the time you're done. And Grant, when it comes to lament in the book of James, you went from there's one article in the world to now a dissertation in a book. So you've certainly owned that space, and I love that. But it does. I mean, it is interesting. James, this whole lament theme. I didn't think much about it until you wrote about it. But James sort of reframes suffering not as something to just endure, but something to bring before God honestly, which ties it into that. But unpack for us how he reframes some of that suffering.
He does it in a really unexpected way, I think. If we take James 1:2, this verse that we've already talked about briefly, I think we can get the sense that as Christians, we know that Christ has overcome the grave, that he's risen from the dead, that he's currently reigning in heaven at the right hand of the Father. And that in and of itself gives us reason to have joy, because we know that he's returning to us, and we know that when he returns, he will make all things right. So simply on that Christological and eschatological basis, we can understand why we should have joy in the midst of suffering. Yet, I think James certainly would fully endorse that and agree to that. But I think he sees a lot more going on, and he goes more deeply into the Old Testament and kind of resources his language of perseverance and his language of suffering with the Old Testament laments. And the way that he does that, I think, is he alludes to certain Old Testament Psalms. And there's two key ways that he does this that I think are really helpful for us. One of those ways is in James 3, when he's talking about the tongue. This is one of the most famous portions of the letter of James. And if you read it long enough and often enough, it will make you not want to say anything at all. But to say something about this text, what really stood out to me is James uses the language of several Old Testament lament psalms to characterize the tongue as an enemy itself. It's similar to the way that Paul describes sin in Romans 5, 6, and 7. James does something very similar with the tongue, where he uses Old Testament lament language to characterize the tongue as an enemy that lives within us, that is seeking to work against us and ultimately to destroy us. Because he does this very surprising thing of actually assigning the tongue quite a bit of agency and control and the freedom to do as it pleases, because that is how it often feels. The tongue, we say things and we instantly feel regret. We instantly realize, man, I shouldn't have said that. It's as if my tongue just kind of went off and did its own thing. And James understands that, and he characterizes the tongue in a way that helps us to see that it really is an enemy that we have to seek to control. And then the other way is in James 5, in the passage that I briefly talked about, James 5, 1-6. I think that James is using the Old Testament lament language to characterize these landlords who are withholding the wages from these farmers that he mentions in James 5:4. So in order to characterize them as enemies, he uses the language of the Old Testament lament psalms, but also language from the book of Jeremiah, especially Jeremiah chapter 13, to describe them in such a way where he's implying and suggesting to his readers that these people are just like God's enemies of the past, and they will not get away with their evil deeds. It's actually an implicit way of encouraging these people who are suffering greatly at their hands. And not only will these enemies not get away with what they've done, but you who are doing what you should be doing it and crying out to God amidst your suffering, you righteous sufferers will be vindicated. You will be saved by God, one way or the other. It might not take a shape and a timing that you expect or desire in this moment, but God will not forget you, and God has not abandoned you in your suffering. He hears you. Your cries have reached his ears, and he will do something about it. So that's one way that James is kind of reframing our suffering. And then I think the key really comes to his mention of Job in Job 5:11. But again, I can kind of save that for its own explanation, because that will require some time.
Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating, though. The whole conversation here is, I think, helpful. Before we leave the count it all joy verse and move on to some of the others, you do make a tie here to lament and joy. Are they in tension? Do they belong together? How should we think about lament and joy?
There is a tension, and I do think they belong together. Most often, the explanation that I hear for lament and joy, and this could be right, and it's a fair explanation. I see it a little bit differently, but the explanation I most often hear is that lament and joy are things that we should experience kind of simultaneously, as if we're kind of always on the one hand joyful and on the one hand lamenting. But maybe I'm saying too much about myself. I find it very hard to express both of those things at the same time. So I think that James, what he envisions is essentially the progression that we find in the Old Testament lament psalms, where there is lots of space and lots of room and lots of time devoted to our laments, to our cries, to our honest expression of how we're wrestling through our difficult circumstances. And yet there's some type of pivot or some type of turn to confidence, hope, joy in the Lord. So it's not as if they're kind of constantly up and running in our hearts and in our emotions, but we kind of create space for both expressions. And what I think James would say is that because Christ is risen, and because God doesn't waste our suffering, because God uses our suffering to work perseverance and perfection and wholeness and completeness in us, that's the reason why joy at some point is always an appropriate expression. I'm not comfortable saying, after X number of days you should turn to joy, but at some point, because Christ is risen and reigning, and because God doesn't waste our suffering, joy is appropriate to express.
Makes sense. Matter of fact, last week on the program, we actually had this theme was similar. We talked about a new book from Anne Graham Lotz and Rachel Ruth Lotz Wright. They wrote a book called God Won't Leave You There, Joseph's Story. And we talked a lot about kind of suffering. And it's interesting that I think that Christians often struggle with having these kind of conversations. I came to Christ in a tradition that basically, I don't know if it was explicitly said, but it's basically, now that you're a Christian, You got joy, joy down in your heart. I'm happy all the time. I'm happy all the time. And I found out very quickly, I mentioned the death of my sister at a young age. I found out very quickly that that was not the Christian life. It wasn't always happy, happy, happy all the time. And I think the challenge is that struggle to find where lament fits into that. So we got about 30 minutes till 30 seconds till the bottom of the program. How would you encourage in 30 seconds for Christians to find space for lament in their own lives?
Lament it's in a way not something that we can practice because we don't want to force it. It is necessarily responsive, yet we know as Christians that it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when we will suffer. And it's in those moments that I think we need to create space emotionally and relationally to give ourselves the freedom to cry out to God and express our suffering honestly to Him.
Good, good, good. We're going to continue our conversation with Grant Flynn in just a moment. And remember, we're pre-recorded this program, so we can't take your calls. But I do want to encourage you to pick up the book, Lament in the Letter of James, or see Grant Flynn's good work at Phoenix Seminary there in the Valley, as they call it. We'll continue our conversation with Grant Flynn in just a moment. All right, we're back, and we're talking about lament. And I just noticed that the Ed Stetzer Live, bumper music is very peppy and uppy, and that kind of reminds us of maybe our church experience. That's that way. We talked earlier about how church sort of starts on a high note and ends on a high note, and maybe stays on the high note the whole time. Yet, difficult times are very real. I have a very close friend whose his son-in-law. He just literally posted it earlier today. Had a heart attack. There's nothing they can do medically, and it's just grieving. They love the Lord. He loves the Lord. He's a guy with teenage children, and it does. We go to the Lord and say, "Why?" I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've asked the Lord, "Why, Lord?" And leaning in on some of these lament questions is why I feel a freedom to say that, "Why, Lord?" But I guess the question, Grant, that I want to just pose to you for just a minute is, like, personally, you just talked about circumstances might bring on that lament. We can go to the Lord with our concerns and our hurt and our questions. But, like, what do you think that means for churches? Like, what should churches do or not do, particularly in the gathered worship time related to lament?
I have been encouraged in the last 5 to 10 years how I think churches are trying to create space to lament, whether it's things that are going on in their own congregations or things that are going on around the world, just to say these things are really hard and they're causing a lot of pain for people. If we're thinking about worldwide situations, they may not be causing pain here at home, but we can, in a way, come side to side with our brothers and sisters around the world and cry out on their behalf. And I think that really is a biblical model. I think that's what we find in the prophets in many places where the prophets, Jeremiah comes to mind, where he hasn't done anything wrong, but he's interceding on behalf of the people and crying out for them so that God might change their circumstances, so that God might be kind and comfort them or help them in some way. So as we think about, we could always on every Sunday morning set aside time for praying for our brothers and sisters around the world, because somebody somewhere is suffering greatly for the sake of the gospel or in whatever circumstance one may find themselves. So thinking globally, I think there is a way that we can genuinely and naturally set aside time for lament on a week-to-week basis. But I think there's possibly a way that we could do that even locally in our own congregations or within our own cities, thinking about the difficult things that are happening around us. And I think we could do that in a non-invasive way for the people in our pews to say, if you would like for us to pray for you, and if it's okay to of course, not overshare, but to share something about what's going on in your life, people would love to pray for you. People would love to lament with you and on your behalf and to seek God's help and comfort for you in this time of need. So we can think locally, globally, individually about how we might kind of lock arms with our brothers and sisters and cry out to God for his help in our times of need. I think I would love to see churches continue to do that. And I think it could express itself also in the songs that we sing. Some churches that follow a more kind of liturgical structure have kind of a more lament space in their worship, usually in the first half of the service, or a more kind of it takes on a more sorrowful tone, a more serious tone, and that can be helpful just as a way of saying to those people who are suffering and maybe haven't told anybody about it, hey, we know that you're dealing with difficult things, and here's space for you to really lean in and express yourself to God through song. I think both of those ways could be helpful for us as the church.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I was thinking of this recently because I have a friend who's a pastor who's been going through a difficult time. This is a different pastor I just mentioned, and he's been public about it and shared it. And so when that's the case, when a pastor is going through a difficulty, the whole church sort of does. I mean, the pastor shares it. Maybe they lament with that pastor on that journey, and yet there are a lot of people in the pew who the whole church doesn't know their struggle. They can't lament with them, and I don't have a really answer to this, but I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we help lean into that together, and some of the ways, like I said, on prayer request time and other times lifting those needs before the Lord. But it is sort of interesting to think about this. Do you see? And again, I'm jumping around outside of the topics of your book, but do you see lament being I don't know, regained or re-engaged by maybe younger generations, or are there segments of the church like, man, I see them leaning in on this? Because I would say I think of sometimes churches in the African American context. There's a history more in engaging in questions of lament. But do you see generational or cultural differences to engaging lament?
I Anecdotally, I think, just thinking about what I see around me, I think there is something to that. I think younger generations, because of maybe the things that they prioritize and prize as values, things like authenticity and genuine emotional expression, are more open to lamenting, or more open to expressing themselves in this way. Yet it's interesting in that yet they don't typically have the experience and the lifelong suffering to really kind of draw them into that space. Some of them certainly do, but generally speaking, those who have lived longer have a life full of suffering and difficulty and plight and hardship, to where they can legitimately lean into lament and create space for those things. Perhaps one way that we could, thinking of the church universally, become more comfortable with lament and begin to think about it more and create space for it more, maybe it begins in the pulpit, teaching the Psalms of Lament, teaching the ways in which the Bible encourages us to bring our sufferings honestly before God in various circumstances. And I'm sure that there are lots of churches out there doing that. I know churches that I've been in have certainly sought to do that. And I do think that many pastors sense this need to teach their congregations about it because of the suffering locally and globally. And I do think that they want to help their congregation see what it looks like to faithfully lament, in light of the emphasis on lament in the New Testament, and also in light of the New Testament's emphasis on hope and joy. And that's where it can be difficult, because the New Testament does emphasize joy and hope so much, yet we know that lament doesn't totally fade or disappear when we read the New Testament. And we know that there's certainly space for that today. So I think the more we teach on it, the more we think about it, the more we preach from these difficult texts, the more that we may become more comfortable with expressing ourselves in this way before the Lord.
Which I just think is healthy. I really think Christians sometimes just think that they've got to be perpetually happy all the time. I actually make a point of posting on social media occasionally that I had a bad day or I'm struggling with this, because if you're perpetually happy, there's something wrong with you. Like, you should seek help for that, because all of us have times, and life's unfair and we're struggling, and how we respond really matters, and we can go to the Lord. And that brings us back to this character of Job. So let's talk a little bit about Job. We mentioned him earlier, but unpack a little bit of lament there, and then tie it maybe even together where we're headed in the book of James.
As we mentioned, James starts his book raising up joy as this virtue, this emotion that they should experience, not only experience, but they should demonstrate themselves and display themselves. Yet, as I try to show in my book, there's a lot of what I call lament material. James alluding to Old Testament laments, James exhorting his readers to lament, and James referencing the cries of these harvesters in James 5:4. And then we come to James 5:11, where James says, "And we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Now, we typically don't think of Job as a positive example of perseverance, but this is precisely what James presents him to be to his readers. And this is the only mention of Job, the only explicit mention of Job in the entire New Testament. And as Christians, we kind of scratch our heads at this to say, he could have mentioned anyone when he's holding up a model for perseverance. He could have mentioned David. He obviously could have mentioned Jesus, but he mentions Job. So why does he do that? Well, in order to see what James sees in Job's perseverance, I think we have to take a brief detour back to the book of Job. Now, in the prologue of Job, the narrator establishes two main facts. The first fact concerns Job's character. The narrator describes Job in a very positive way. He's blameless and upright, one who feared the Lord and turned away from evil. And this is really a statement about Job's character. And it's important that even God himself affirms this evaluation of Job. And what I think the narrator is doing here is he's piling up evidence of Job's virtuous character ahead of these really difficult dialogue cycles where Job wears his heart on his sleeve and pours his heart out to God and also pours his heart out to his friends. And I think what the narrator is doing is saying, no matter what transpires, no matter what is coming in this book, you should remember this positive description of Job. And then the second fact that we have to keep in mind with Job concerns his speech. When Satan comes to God, he identifies Job's speech as the means by which he might prove that Job just does not truly trust God. This is where Satan says, "But now stretch out your hand and strike everything that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Of course, cursing is something that we do with our words. So the issue that Satan raises is not simply Job's faithfulness to God in suffering, but also the type of speech that Job's suffering would produce. And even though these dialogue cycles that are coming are very difficult, they're very complex, the narrator stresses that Job, despite everything that happened to him and all that he said, he did not sin. So the narrator of Job is drawing a special attention to Job's speech and the way that his suffering would produce a certain type of speech in the end of the book. Now, that takes us to the very end of the book, where the epilogue, chapter 42, confirms that this book really has been focused on the type of speech that Job's suffering would produce. So after the dialogue cycles end, the central issue that God himself raises is, who spoke rightly of me? And God says that it's Job that speaks rightly of him. Yes, Job's perspective is incomplete, but he still is the one that spoke rightly of him and not Job's friends. And we have to ask the question, well, how then did Job speak? Well, we have to define his language, I think, as the language of lament. It's these righteous complaints, these righteous protests that he brings before the Lord in his moment of great distress. So God's approval of Job's speech in the epilogue indicates that God approves of these righteous laments, and it implies that lament is an appropriate response to suffering. So overall, the beginning and end of Job leave no doubt that Job perseveres righteously, and God's approval of Job's laments indicate that his laments are the righteous means by which he perseveres. And the way that I describe it in my book is Job's perseverance is a lament-shaped perseverance. Now, going back to the book of James, if this is what James is holding up as the model for perseverance, this type of Job, this suffering and lamenting Job, then I think James is signaling that it's Job's lament-shaped perseverance that informs his understanding of the entire virtue of perseverance, which he mentions only in James 5:11, and then that text that we love, James 1:2-4. Those are the only two places he mentions perseverance. So it suggests that there's a relationship between those two verses. So this means that perseverance for James, if we go back and read James 1:2-4 with this Job-like perseverance in mind, it means that perseverance for James is not a passive, fatalistic submission to trials, but is this active, lamenting, faith-filled fortitude that holds God to his promises, that trusts God and cries out amid suffering from that position of great trust and belief in the faithfulness of God. So I think James's point is that joy is the proper response to the divinely designed and maturing and perfecting effects of trials, while lament is the proper response to the trials themselves and the suffering they inflict.
I find that strangely encouraging because and we'll talk more about that on the other side, but we're going to turn our conversation with Grant Flynn. His new book is on lament in the Lament in the letter of James, and we're going to continue our conversation. Remember, this is a pre-recorded show, so we can't take your calls, but stay with us. We've got one more segment to go with Grant Flynn. Okay, we're back. Ed Stetzer Live. I'm Ed Stetzer, and our conversation today is with Grant Flynn. Dr. Flynn serves at Phoenix Seminary and teaches New Testament there, and his new book is on lament in the letter of James. And so we're talking about that very topic, lament. And so we're also, this is a pre-recorded show, so we're not taking your calls today, but give us more time to dig a little deeper. And if you've been enjoying the program, you can hear it again, share it with other people. Go to edstetzerlive.com. The link to this program's there, but also the link to his book, Lament in the Letter of James, is there. Also, his bio in Phoenix Seminary, all listed there as well. So, Grant, when you're sort of unpacking that, I said I was strangely encouraged by this because partly, I don't know, this is maybe the pastor in me. I find it strange and unhelpful that when really bad things happen, Christians think the only response that they're allowed to have is some sort of happiness to it. And I think, there's a difference between joy and happiness and levels to that. But so for example, someone gets in a severe car accident and they said, man, I only broke my hips, my hip. I only broke my legs. And I'm like, no, it's like sad. Like it's a drunk driver hits you. That's something to go, Lord, why? I don't understand. Help me through. Now, I don't want to put, on people that they have to respond a certain way. But my concern is they only think that they can respond by basically saying, a really bad thing happened, but I'm happy because I'm a Christian. So that's where I find your comments freeing in that space. So I know your book is it's a scholarly book. It's your dissertation. I think people find it super helpful. But come with me in that pastoral space and help me and our listeners to think about what's okay to respond to really bad things in ways that still honor the Lord.
Yes, it certainly is. We have to affirm that from the start, that it is okay to express ourselves honestly before God in those moments of great suffering, and that we can ask those hard questions like how long and why. And I don't think that those are given to us in the Old Testament simply as a way of saying this is how people used to relate to God. This is how people used to speak and pray to God. But now that Christ has come and defeated death, now that's no longer appropriate. I don't think that is the right response at all. And I think that we get that sense because we do see in the New Testament this emphasis on joy amidst suffering. And the reason I think that emphasis is there is because we know what's coming, because we know that Christ is coming back and that he will make everything right. Yet that doesn't mitigate or make our suffering now insignificant to the degree that we can't lean into the expression of lament. And there's one biblical example that I have come to see as incredibly helpful and encouraging, and it comes from the gospel. So it's rooted in a story, and perhaps this can be helpful for those who are listening. It's in this story that we love so much in John 11, the raising of Lazarus. And it's in the way that Martha and Mary speak to Jesus, because this story is set up by John with these helpful timestamps where Jesus hears word that Lazarus has died, and the sisters are saying, Jesus, come now so that you can help him, because they really believe that if Jesus comes, that he can heal him. But Jesus waits 4 days to actually arrive and show up there. And when he finally arrives, the sisters, I think understandably, kind of walk out to him and they're saying, Lord, why didn't you come? And what they both say to him is really profound. They say, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then Martha, right after that, has this great expression of faith. Yet, I still believe that anything you ask, God will give you. And there, in those two sentences, is really the progression that we see in the Bible of lament, moving from righteous complaint, heartfelt lament, to an expression of confidence. And it's rooted in this real circumstance of Lazarus, their brother, whom they dearly loved, dying. And I think that the fact that this is given to us in the New Testament, where they're speaking directly to Jesus, should give us the freedom and help us lean into the reality that, yes, I can express myself to God in the same way that Mary and Martha did, asking these difficult questions. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. We too can speak to God like that and honestly bring our thoughts before him.
So good. We got a couple minutes left in the program. So as you kind of work through both your dissertation and writing this book, and now you teach on this, how did your own maybe understanding or relationship with suffering and prayer and endurance, did they change at all?
They did. I still have to catch myself and remind myself, hey, don't rush the process. Don't rush people along into the space of joy, because everyone is different. And I don't know all the details. I don't know all of the emotions that any given person is feeling when they're suffering. And I need to give them the space that they need to work through that with God. And the best that I can do is lament alongside them and encourage them to keep crying out to God, because I firmly believe that lament is an expression of faith. It's not an expression of doubt, because in the very act of turning to God and crying out to him in the first place, that takes faith, and that's a faithful response. And I truly believe that God meets us in those moments and does supply us the comfort and the help that we need.
Yeah, I think so too. And I find leaning into these topics helpful and encouraging in a strange way, because I think it gives permission. I mean, I think counselors would tell us we need permission to lament. We need to be able to go to the Lord in our struggles as well. So, Grant, thanks for leaning in on this topic. Thanks for the good work you're doing there at Phoenix Seminary. And again, if you go to edstetserlive.com, you can go and find the link to the book, Lament in the Letter of James. And so we're excited to be able to share that with you as well. Again, thanks for listening to Ed Stetzer Live. And let me thank my team, my behind-the-scenes team here at Moody Radio. Karen Hendren is my engineer. Merle St. James Karen's my producer. Merle is my engineer. And my associate producer is Lisa Chifty. To hear this program again, you go to edstetserlive.com. It's always there. You can subscribe via podcast there as well. All the resources you need. Also, you can subscribe to all the Moody Radio podcasts there as well. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all at Ed Stetzer Live. And remember, Ed Stetzer Live is a production of Moody Radio, which is a ministry of Moody Bible Institute. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next Saturday.